And I've met a lot of people, actors who are incredibly shy, who you think are very, big personalities. But it makes sense because when we play a character, we escape into someone else, and that's the way in which we, step outside of ourselves. So as someone who's very shy and very, personal, it is strange to make a video of yourself in a bathroom. It doesn't totally make sense to me. I made so many more videos than I could ever post.
Hey friends, I've been deep into some heavy research these last few days after watching a press conference that really shook me. It happened in Washington, D.C., where a group of survivors of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell stood together on the steps of the Capitol. They spoke openly about what they endured, many for the very first time. These were people who had been silenced for decades, finally telling their stories in public. Listening to them was powerful and heartbreaking. Their main demand was for the federal government to release all the sealed files connected to Epstein, to expose every single name, and to hold everyone accountable, not just Epstein and Maxwell, but every person who was part of their network. I had followed the Epstein case a little before, but I had never gone too deep because I was busy covering other issues at the time. But diving back in now, I quickly noticed something surprising. One of the attorneys who represented Epstein's survivors also represents actress Blake Lively in her legal battles. That connection caught me off guard. It made me wonder why a Hollywood star would seek out the same legal team that fought on behalf of women abused by one of the most notorious predators in recent history. One of the most well-known survivors, Virginia Roberts, was outspoken for years before her tragic death earlier this year. She had first met Epstein when she was 17, while working at Mar-a-Lago, after being introduced to him by Maxwell. Virginia went on to file lawsuits against Epstein, Maxwell, and even Prince Andrew, naming him publicly. She fought tirelessly through civil courts to seek justice, and her attorney was the same one now connected to Blake Lively. That detail made me think. For someone like Blake Lively, aligning herself with lawyers who already have a reputation for protecting women against powerful men gives her a kind of credibility. On one hand, it makes sense, those attorneys have experience taking on influential figures. But on the other hand, it creates an image of Blake as part of the same category as women who were victims of trafficking and abuse. It's a bold choice, especially considering the stark differences in background. Epstein and Maxwell often targeted vulnerable girls from poor or unstable households. Many came from struggling neighborhoods around West Palm Beach. Some had already faced abuse, homelessness, or neglect before being drawn in with offers of easy money. They were promised small payments, maybe $200 for a massage, but behind that was a system of exploitation. These were children and young women without resources, without protection, and without the power to fight back. Blake Lively, in contrast, is married to Ryan Reynolds, whose business ventures have made hundreds of millions of dollars. She is surrounded by privilege and opportunity, nothing like the victims Epstein preyed upon. That's why seeing her tie herself to the same attorneys feels complicated. The legal teams that fought for Epstein's survivors worked hard, sometimes taking cases pro bono, or on contingency, meaning they only got paid if the victims won. Through class actions, they even sued big banks like JP Chase and Deutsche Bank for enabling Epstein's crimes. Those lawsuits brought large settlements and more recognition for the attorneys involved. So now, when someone like Blake Lively hires the same kind of legal team, it's not just about having skilled lawyers, it's also about how it looks. It places her next to women who endured unimaginable abuse, even if her own circumstances are very different. On the law firm's website, they proudly explained that Judge Rakoff approved their request for a 30% fee, which added up to $87 million. The judge even commented that in his nearly 3 decades on the bench, he had rarely seen such a strong settlement achieved so quickly in a case this complex. This came after they sued JP Chase, one of the banks that handled Jeffrey Epstein's finances. The firm also secured another major settlement with Deutsche Bank, valued at $75 million. Out of that, the lawyers were again granted 30% in fees, another $22.5 million. Altogether, from just those two settlements, the attorneys and their co-counsel collected about $109 million. It's important to note that they worked for years on behalf of Epstein's survivors to reach this outcome. Still, while many argue these lawyers earned their fees, it doesn't erase the uncomfortable truth that no amount of money will ever undo what happened to those victims. The women and girls who endured Epstein's abuse live with permanent scars. Some have taken their own lives, unable to cope with the trauma. Others have battled substance abuse, alcoholism, or time in prison as a result of the emotional damage they carried. Settlements, no matter how large, do not magically fix that kind of pain. Class action lawsuits like this operate on a contingency system. That means the survivors didn't pay anything up front. Instead, the lawyers agreed to work with the understanding that if a settlement or judgment was won, they would take 30%. This arrangement makes legal help available to people who otherwise could never afford it. But it also raises ethical questions. Lawyers know that when massive payouts are possible, they can build up endless paperwork, billable hours, and legal motions to justify even higher fees. The more they claim in expenses, the more they can argue for in court. So while these firms did crucial work, there is also an element of self-interest that can't be ignored. The firm involved, where attorney Sigrid Macaulay works, represented several key Epstein survivors, including Virginia Roberts and Annie Farmer. They even had a client testify against Ghislaine Maxwell during her trial. But most survivors were represented by another lawyer, Brad Edwards, who handled a larger portion of the cases. So while Macaulay's firm was part of the fight, they were not the only legal team involved. What really shocked me was learning how that same firm, after only 6 months of representing Leslie Sloan, requested $1.3 million in attorney's fees. The court had dismissed the case, deciding there was no proof of actual malice. Essentially, if Sloan had repeated what Blake Lively told her and believed it was true, then she could not be found guilty of lying. The judge even refused to grant attorney's fees automatically, saying they would only be considered if filed in a separate motion. Yet Sloan's lawyers went ahead and asked for that enormous amount in such a short span of litigation. That's when I started questioning whether some of the work being done for Blake Lively might also be operating under contingency-like incentives. Blake clearly has the means to afford her attorneys, but when law firms see the potential for big paydays, especially with wealthy opponents involved, they often push aggressively. Whether or not that's happening here is uncertain, but the possibility adds a layer of complexity to how these high-profile cases unfold. Blake Lively was not filing a lawsuit of her own. She was hiring lawyers to defend herself against claims that had been made. Leslie Sloan was not listed as a co-plaintiff in Blake's case. The filings named Blake alone, so Leslie was not entering the courtroom as a victim or a partner in the legal action. This raised an interesting question: were the lawyers inflating their fees to secure a bigger payout? The fact that they had to file more than one motion for attorney's fees suggests they were worried about not being compensated. At one point, they even asked for $1.3 million for just 6 months of work. When you compare that request to the same firm's history of collecting $109 million in fees from settlements with banks tied to Jeffrey Epstein, it feels extreme. There's another odd layer. Leslie Sloan has long-standing connections to powerful people with troubling pasts, including Harvey Weinstein. After being dismissed from her old PR firm, she launched her own company, Vision PR, which was backed financially by Weinstein. She also represented him directly, as well as some of his associates. Later, many of those same associates were accused by survivors of harassment and abuse. It's worth remembering that Weinstein himself had ties to Jeffrey Epstein. The two were known to socialize, tried to buy a magazine together in 2003, and were seen publicly together in 2006. This overlap makes the picture even murkier. Here's where the irony really stands out. the very same firm now connected to Blake and Leslie once defended Weinstein. The law group, Boies Schiller Flexner, was accused of hiring intelligence companies to track and intimidate Weinstein's accusers, as well as journalists covering the story. That scandal damaged the firm's reputation so badly that the New York Times, which had been one of its clients, cut ties. Many of the firm's lawyers later resigned, frustrated by its willingness to protect men like Weinstein and disgraced biotech founder Elizabeth Holmes. The firm has also been criticized in other cases for inflating fees and pushing the limits of ethical billing. So on one hand, this firm represented Epstein survivors and won settlements that exposed banks, which enabled his crimes. On the other hand, it once defended Weinstein and allegedly tried to silence his accusers. That contradiction is hard to ignore. For Blake and Leslie, hiring Sigrid McCauley from this firm gives them an appearance of aligning with victims, since McCauley is known for representing women trafficked by Epstein. But in truth, Blake and Leslie are not trafficking victims. They are wealthy women with access to resources. Blake is married to Ryan Reynolds, whose net worth is estimated at hundreds of millions. Leslie built a career in PR with Weinstein's backing. Their backgrounds are nothing like the disadvantaged young women who were drawn into Epstein's circle. That's why the choice to hire this firm looks calculated. It seems less about survival and more about optics, using McCauley's reputation as a shield, as if to borrow legitimacy from Epstein's survivors. But when you remember the firm's history of defending abusers, the whole thing feels unsettling. To some, it might even look like Blake and Leslie are trying to launder credibility through association, when in reality, their situations bear no resemblance to those of the women who suffered under Epstein. Make sure to like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments.